Okay, so the rest of the story is that during that time, and like I said, the monks used um, small boys, and they taught them, and then they taught them how to farm. They also taught them bookkeeping. And since women at that time in the kitchens and pretty much farmhand women didn't learn to read or write, once, well, and they usually picked the monks, usually picked the women that were outcasts among the group to marry these farmers that they taught to be. And then when they would travel, the monks, they would have reason to stop and stay at these houses. And they didn't have horses. Horses were too expensive. And since monks usually were the one or two or three, they didn't have a stable. They didn't have hands to like take care of the horses. So they would get rides from farm to farm, and there was a network of them around back then. And no one would dare stop a monk because they weren't like priests at the time or church figures. They were more solitary, writers and keepers of knowledge. And so the farmers would then in turn teach their wives how to read. And they often didn't mix with their own family. They would go, the farmers would take the monks then to another farm. It'd be easy then to deliver messages. Even at one time, monks started to make ales. Like at one time, they made, well, that saison du pain, and it was small, but then monks could travel freely to farms to like trade goods. And who would stop a learned monk at that time? Not many people. They were often not, you know, they knew that monks were poor, so no one would ever try to rob them. It was weird, though, seeing that. And they always had a place to stay, they always had a network. And I told you back in early, like in Scone and stuff, when the nations were divided back then, and part of Sweden was part of Denmark, or it's even further back than that. But the church kept records of not just, when I said at one time just for taxation reason, but they also were keeping track of what family members, and even if family members weren't direct family members, they would mark them down as foster children of a different sister or brother. Like some came to America that way, and so they were counted as family, or they were counted as daughters and sons. And in all rights, they were. Oh, lighting. So, more about the monks. So, I told you that they learned a lot of the secrets, you know, and they kept it under wraps pretty good. It wasn't until the church started to interfere, and that, you know, and at that time, too, the monks weren't the ones that were hurting children. It was usually the wealthy landowners and heads of churches. Again, children were considered property. And so monks were more solitary, you know. They often did live near like an established village or in like say a large castle, but they weren't really in this, they didn't socialize, and they were often off doing things or writing, transcribing, doing written work or keeping history. They had their own they had their own, I wouldn't want to call it an order, but their own, they did have their own agenda. And much of it had to do with tracking families and getting out information. Like I said before, a lot of the women had court members from the church come to meet them. Monks rarely did that. Monks were more interested in meeting the people of the villages and going to individual farms, and those networks that they had created made for really safe communities that they could travel to, and no one would refuse them hospitality at that time. I don't even know what time this is. I can see it in my mind though, them traveling and getting rides from farmers. Like I said, they didn't keep horses themselves. I feel like one of them is telling me, right? Like, and they usually worked in sets of threes, or two or three, with one usually out. And that's why they would have, young boys from the women that who had male children who weren't working in the field. They would take one of them in and help them. It was easier too than working in the field, and they were kind to them. They weren't like abusing them, or it was hard work though. They did make them work pretty hard. But they could also do things that the older monks, they didn't have the dexterity anymore. So it was nice to have them as apprentice, even though they weren't going to become monks. They needed them to be farmers. They needed them to be out in the community, so they had these um, networks. Some did become monks. There weren't many though, and they could tell which ones they could. Oh, I want to say there weren't more than two working at a time with them, and I'm just trying to think. Well, they did rarely socialize with the other boys too, and at that time it was, I don't know. I want to say like, I don't know, a long time ago, like 1400 something before then. I'm trying to get a sense of like, and the farms at that time were situated in such a manner that you could easily, they were far enough away from each other that you didn't have to worry about nosy neighbors. um I think they were on purpose, the length of distance they were. No. And the monks knew about, I told you about herbal remedies. So they were able to teach about things to, right things to eat, so that families would be strong through some of the hard winters. And it wasn't always easy. And women, once they learned to read, or once they learned that about bookkeeping, had to keep that a secret. And many times they just played ignorant in those small villages. Well, and then once people found out, they were accused then of witchcraft and plotting against the church, because they were learned women then with no noble blood. And they were a threat. Well, they were a threat to other women, and they were a threat to the church. And this one guy is like telling me, well, and no one would have told on the monks. no one did. And even though monks did try to protect some of these people and held them in, like got them into safe houses, a lot of times monks were killed along with them, trying to protect them. And the church had no loyalty to monks. They were not the same as priests. They were not the same. They were not considered the same. Well, because at certain times, the church, they married and did whatever they did and ruled by class and by fear and money. And monks really didn't have that much. What they did have, they really did share with their farmers. It was because they were secretly sending messages through them. And that really a lot of times made even the families of the women there really distant because they didn't want to let on that they knew anything. And a lot of times it was safer to be silent in those farmhouses or those cottages, whatever you would call those back then. They were kind of communities though, even though they were far apart. Well, and you were more apt to call like a castle or like a walled city, that kind of village, which was really just kind of one shanty town, basically. you know. And on the outskirts then were the farms that the monks would freely go to. And like I said, no one would dare harm them because they didn't have any money. And they knew well enough that they could hide messages in script and have every reason to go there, to see how their students had done, to give the words out. But it was a different time. And this one guy keeps like, yeah. And then it really got bad for them. And then it got bad. And a lot of them were either forced to go into hiding or they were forced to join the church and work in secret within the church. And then they were kind of roped into the church, which at that time was not a pretty church. You could be easily killed just by, I don't know, it was not a pretty church. There was a lot of, and a lot of the say didn't come from the church. Even though the church had married into wealth, and that's how it established a lot of its wealth, is taxing the poor and farmers, and then marrying their own family members into wealth. A lot of the decisions came from, wealthy men and women, but more apt to say it came from women. They had the sway in the court at that time. They knew everyone. Men often were not to be bothered with, like, who's who, and women always knew. It's a different world, though. And women often would blame their husbands. That they didn't know any better. And they could almost be then removed from accusation. But men got wise to that, and the church did too. And that's when some were like, oh yeah, we know. But even, and the sneakiest women, I know who they were. They knew everything. They knew more than some of the noble women. They knew well enough, though. They would poison them, though. I know that much for sure. And there was always some kind of illness that a nursemaid or that a maid needed to take care of. And women sometimes were way too sick to nurse, so then a wet nurse would have to do it. Well, obviously, other women were like, they wanted to form bonds with those children. Back then, it was all about, I won't even say. It was a different time. And I'm thinking about it. I'm just thinking, well, I told you that a lot of times their diets made their estrogen and progesterone levels different. And what they ate was different. And it affected their hormone levels. It's just interesting. It's food for thought. I don't know. I just keep getting these messages like, oh. I can almost remember a lot of the herbal remedies that they kept. I mean, I've studied a lot of herbal remedies, but I was thinking about some particular ones. I don't know. They turned them into medicine at one time. I don't know. Of course, they were just as good as some medicine. And a lot of times, though, it was like I said in the video before that didn't get aired, it was when they were collected, what time of day, and the concentration of the extract that was actually in them. And since a lot of studies were never done on a large, well, I guess drug companies did studies, but then again, they're drug companies, you know. And there's something about the binders in some chemicals. Some people say they're allergic to drugs, to medicine. And it's not so much that they're allergic to the medicinal compound in it. Sometimes it's the binders that they use. Not that I would know. You know, what, me being a nurse for as long as I was and studying everything that I did and realizing what I knew a long time ago.